You must stay at home. Stay at home.
Hello and welcome to Lockdown, hosted by Steve Bomford with Mike Davis-Marks. Our armed forces operate in challenging environments. Week by week, we'll explore what we can learn from their experiences.
Hello, Steve. So who have you got lined up for the next episode of Lockdown Podcast?
Well, for this episode, we have, I believe, once again, a friend of yours, Nigel Langhorn.
Yes, I know Nigel quite well. In fact, I've known Nigel for about nearly 40 years, 38 years, I think, since 1982, when I first met him when he came back from the Falklands. A lovely chap. And I crossed paths with him in a good way more recently. So looking forward to hear this.
Yes, it's an interesting one. It's definitely an interview of two halves, I think. Can you tell me about your life in the Royal Navy and what you've learnt from it in the context of COVID-19?
Certainly. I mean, I joined the Navy in the late 70s, straight from school at 18 as a young lad, and spent 35 years in the Royal Navy. 20 of those years were at sea or in operational jobs on the front line. Spent a lot of time away from home, obviously. And thoroughly enjoyed my career. Had a great time and a really enjoyable career. Served in a lot of smaller ships, patrol boats, frigates, and destroyers. Was never a big ship man, but that was fine. And as part of my career, I've been all over the world. Obviously, I've seen lots of different countries and cultures, and also spent 2 years living out in the United States working with the US Navy, which was a great experience as well. So it's been an interesting career. I've also seen active service, both in the Falklands, also in Northern Ireland, and in the first Gulf War as well, and in the Balkans conflict in the late 90s. So all of those have been, excellent experiences and have fitted me well for the rest of my naval career, but also what happened thereafter. I think in terms of how has it prepared me for what's happening now, I think certainly isolation is clearly an issue at the moment. And when you're on a 6-month deployment to the Gulf, for instance, you get to spend quite a bit of time on your own, funnily enough. And although you're in a tin box surrounded by 250 other people and they're never that far away, sometimes it can be quite lonely. You're never alone, but sometimes it can be quite lonely. And you need to learn to cope with that, and you need to learn to deal with that. And I think one of the biggest things that clearly the military brings to life is routine and discipline, which can certainly serve as well in the current crisis. And I know a lot of people have said that the way they get through their days is by establishing a routine, having some form of discipline to their life. It just sort of gets them through the day. So I think certainly that routine and discipline is a great key to coping with the current crisis. And I think the other one is a sense of purpose. I think one of the big things that the Royal Navy gives you is a great sense of purpose, particularly, if you're in a ship, pretty much everybody knows why you're there, what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that sense of purpose, I think, really helps to generate, a shared belonging and a shared activity. And certainly, whilst people are doing now lots of things that they probably find very difficult, at least the vast majority of people can see the reason why, and they understand what the purpose is, and they accept that. And certainly, my perception is that there's been a huge amount of compliance from the British public about the current situation, because I think they understand why it's happening, and get why it's happening, and I think that's really helpful. So So I think there's a number of things there where certainly that military background and that military career can certainly help, you know, put in perspective what's going on at the moment, and you know, hopefully there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and you know, we will one day look back on this and think, well, that was interesting, and things have certainly changed, but I think we will, you know, reflect on it and at least see that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully.
I think light at the end of the tunnel is absolutely important in this, isn't it? It's critical that we have something to, because without hope, there is nothing, I think it's fair to say. With regards to sense of purpose, this is something that we, you know, as company makers encounter frequently, where people that may be facing challenges in their lives have lost their sense of purpose. And I'm just wondering how you think that might be affected now, particularly with people that may normally get their sense of purpose derived through work. That's now missing for a lot of people, isn't it?
It's a very good point, and I think whilst people understand the reason for what we're doing, you're absolutely right that a lot of people's sense of purpose perhaps revolves around their work, which they can't do now. It revolves around their family, which of course they can't visit now and they can't see. And I think, you know, a lot of family groups are struggling. The wider family groups are struggling because of, you know, that lack of ability to provide for their children or grandchildren or whatever, and so that sense of purpose is really being eroded for them, and that's why I think a lot of people are finding it very difficult. You know, why am I here? It's always a good question, and lots of people have lots of different answers to that. But for a lot of people at the moment, that why am I here is actually has been taken away from them. So you can understand why it's having certainly a significant mental and well-being impact on people, and that's something that we're certainly within my association we're thinking about on a daily basis, about well-being and mental health of our people.
Yeah, I think we could do an entire podcast about why am I here, but we really don't have the time for that, I'm afraid. In terms of your military career, I note that you served on board HMS Ardent during the Falklands. I'd just like to know about that experience and what it means to you.
Yeah, I mean, the Falklands conflict started off in April 1982, and interestingly, the day the Argentinians invaded the Falklands, I was on my way to a wedding, and I actually had quite a nasty car accident on the way to the wedding, and so the whole day was not a good day for me. And I did actually get to the wedding the following day, and that was a colleague of mine on the ship. But interestingly, you know, a week later, he had to say goodbye to his wife of 1 week and head south. So, and I promised to look after him, which was probably a bit rash at the time, but I did manage to do that. But so, you know, the whole experience was clearly, I was only 24 at the time. You know, it was a very formative experience. I mean, in terms of, yeah, the journey down, there was a lot of different emotions, excitement, anticipation. There was a lot of talk about, you know, won't it be great to actually do what we've been training to do for the last number of years? And there was quite a gung-ho attitude to some extent. Interestingly, that changed very significantly on the 4th of May when the Sheffield was sunk. That had a very sobering, I can remember that quite vividly. There was a very sobering impact throughout the whole ship. And I think then it was a case of, oh, actually, this is for real. Yeah, and there was a definite mindset shift after that. And then there was more about anxiety and fear, and, you know, but as in most military organizations, certainly in that time, showing fear was not one of those things that people were encouraged to do for obvious reasons. Even showing anxiety was not necessarily encouraged. But it was it was a a formative experience once we got down there, and then of course we went in on the 21st of May for the landings in San Carlos, and again it was a bit of a surreal experience to start with, because we were much further south than everybody else, doing a particular job down there and off Goose Green, and all the activity was further north, and so for the first 5 or 6 hours we were almost a spectator, which was a bit bizarre. We could see everything going on up there. And there were, Argentinian aircraft flying in, and there were bullets and, missiles flying everywhere, but none of it really affected us. We were just doing what we were doing. That changed very significantly at about 5:30 that evening, when we became the sole focus of the final Argentinian air raid of the day. For reasons that I don't really need to go into now, but we suddenly became the sole focus of that air raid, and there was, depending on which account you listen to, between 15 and 17 aircraft within an hour paid us a visit, and we had a lot of bombs dropped on us, hit by about 12 in total. Significant damage to the ship, obviously, and very sadly we lost 22 people in that encounter, some of which were colleagues of mine in the wardroom, a number of which were people that were in my division, so I was responsible for them. And yeah, I mean, it was just a massive shock. And then, but interestingly, reflecting back on it, the actual day, I can remember when we did the board of inquiry afterwards, somebody said to me, "What was it like?" And I said, "Well, to be honest, it was just like Portland." And to the people in the Navy, what that means is because Portland was where we used to do all our training, and we used to do a lot of training with aircraft coming in attacking us. And actually, the way the ship reacted, the way the ship's company reacted, was exactly the way they'd been trained to react. And so I suppose that was some justification of the training that we'd undergone. It did reflect what was happening for real. But then when we came to abandon ship, it was all a bit, well, why are we doing that? Nobody could. The idea of giving up and leaving the ship was, excuse me, was just not. It had just never occurred to us. But then eventually it became clear that actually we were not going to save the ship, and the captain, Alan West, had to give the order to go, and that took a lot of people by surprise. But and then another ship came alongside us, HMS Yarmouth, and we all transferred over to the Yarmouth. So and then went into San Carlos water and transferred to the Canberra at the time, which had just got rid of all of its troops. And then we left that night and went down to South Georgia and transferred to the QE2, and then came back on the QE2. So we were back in the UK just before the ceasefire was announced. And of course, that was really bizarre, because you went from being, a very high intense warfighting unit to suddenly 12 hours later, actually nothing. And we were talking earlier about sense of purpose, and actually our sense of purpose had been completely taken away from us. And there were a lot of people who thought, well, what do I do now? And the answer was, well, you get on board this cruise liner and you go home. And that a lot of people really struggled with that. And we had to, as an officer corps, we came together and we said, look, we've got to keep people busy. And so we invented all sorts of, again, routines and administration events and things like that, just to keep people busy and trying to, not just let them brood and on what had happened. And so, again, that was very strange, because, we left with just what we were stood up in. And so we had to rebuild pretty much everything. And then when we got back to the UK, we set up a sort of ship's office in HMS Drake in Plymouth. But it was all very strange then, because again, the whole, most people will tell you in the Navy that the ship's company becomes a sort of corporate whole, and you've all got that shared sense of purpose that we were talking about earlier, and suddenly that's all taken away from you. And it was interesting that then the ship's company started to fragment because people were being moved somewhere else, and it became quite a unsettling time for a while. Because people were just disappearing. You'd get back into the office on a Monday morning and so had gone, and so that was very strange. But I think in terms of, emotions as well, in that period, there was a lot of, obviously, sorrow. There was a lot of anger at what had happened. Also, surprisingly, a lot of guilt, which I know I felt, and I know a lot of my colleagues felt, that you go through something like that and you think, well, why did I survive? Especially when you knew quite a number of the people that died and they were close friends of yours. There's that sort of survivor's guilt that you've got to deal with as well, which is really powerful at times. And I know some people really did struggle with that. And so, but I think in terms of what it did, and it is a life-changing moment, there is no doubt. I mean, that is a life-defining moment, something like that. And I think the one word I would sum up in terms of how it's affected me for the rest of my naval career, but also the rest of my life, is probably perspective. And it gives you, looking back on it, it does give you a very different perspective on life, because having survived something like that, you do start to put things into perspective, and what really is important in life, what really is it does matter to you, and so I think that would be probably the one word I would pick out from that experience, is probably perspective, and that's helpful now, of course, in the current situation. I'm trying to, whilst it's dreadful for a lot of people, and I'm not trying to diminish what's happened, but there will be a light at the end of the tunnel, and we will get through this. And that bigger perspective hopefully helps people to look at that.
Thank you very much for sharing that story, and it's obviously a very powerful story, and I can only begin to understand the smallest bit impact that may have had on you. But I think it's also quite pertinent how you draw parallels to how those experiences could be beneficial, dare I say, in the context of where we find ourselves today. But also, I think we were talking prior to this about how you stay in touch with your old comrades and how you manage that in COVID-19. And I think you mentioned some virtual commemoration had happened. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the Ardent Association is a very strong and active association that has been since 1982. Brilliantly run by some of the ex-ships company, and they run a memorial service and a remembrance service every year, and a gathering of the old ships company. And I've been to a number of those. But interestingly, this year, of course, it was due to happen last weekend, and that couldn't take place because of the current situation. So one of the guys who runs it actually did a brilliant job of putting together a virtual memorial service for our lost comrades, and with a number of recorded pieces from various key players. He actually put together a brilliant 20 to 25 minute memorial service, which was streamed on Facebook, and then there was also a Zoom meeting room where people could congregate and exchange thoughts and views as well. So whilst obviously not the same, the modern technology, I think, allowed us to at least mark the occasion appropriately, and actually gave a lot of people time to think and reflect, as we have to do every year, on what happened. So that was really well put together, and really appreciated it.
I think as you've alluded to there, I think it's I think technology has really found a place here, isn't it? In a very positive way. It's very easy to be quite negative about technology and the impacts it has on society, but I think there are some real shining lights here, and I think that is one of them, and how we stay in touch in very difficult circumstances. I'd like to move on to the present day in terms of your employment. You are CEO of Agamemnon Housing Association. I'd like you to tell me a little bit about that. I suspect many of our listeners may not have heard of Agamemnon, so I think a little basic explanation would be really handy, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. The Agamemnon Housing Association has been around for about 50 years now. We are a naval housing association, in essence. We very much come from a naval background. And we provide quality accommodation for over 60 ex-service personnel and their spouses or partners. And we provide that within the Greater Portsmouth area. So we've got 6 schemes, 2 in Gosport, 2 in Portsmouth, 1 in Cosham and 1 in Waterlooville, altogether about 240 individual flats. And we also provide communal facilities in each of those schemes. So we are in effect a private landlord for these people. It's all rented accommodation. But we do give priority to ex-service personnel, particularly ex-naval service. So we do strive very hard to maintain that sort of naval ethos and culture throughout the organisation, and that military ethos and culture, which I think is really helpful and gives us, a sense of identity as well. So that's roughly what we do, we at the moment, of course, it's been a very strange situation for the last few months. Since the beginning of March, to be honest, we were looking very carefully at all this and how would we react as an association, bearing in mind that people can join us at 60. They can be perfectly fit and healthy and still be working at that age. But we do have residents who've been with us for over 30 years and are in their 90s now. And earlier this year, we've actually had 2 100th birthdays, in fact, three 100th birthdays celebrated this year alone, one of whom was a D-Day veteran. So, we have some quite elderly and people with underlying health conditions for which this is, a serious situation for them. It's worth also pointing out that a number of our residents have also received shielding letters from the government or the NHS. So we do have to be very careful about how we operate our schemes in the current situation. So of course we're not a care home. We're not nursing homes. We're sheltered accommodation. But as I say, we do have those underlying conditions and elderly people. So we do need to be very careful. So we've had to adapt very quickly to the way we do our business. And in effect, our schemes are now in lockdown. So only absolutely essential visitors are allowed into the schemes now. So that's created us with issues in terms of family disengagement, which of course is very important to a lot of these people. Some of them are tech savvy, as we were mentioning earlier, and they can talk to their children and grandchildren and so on through the various technical means available, but not all of them are, and so we need to be aware of that as well. And a lot of our schemes prior to COVID were providing lots of social activities, coffee mornings and parties and various things, and of course none of that is happening at the moment either. So even prior to COVID, we as a board in the association were very cognizant of how loneliness and social isolation for elderly people is a significant issue, even before this all happened. Since COVID, of course, that's just been magnified 10 times, and so we are introducing extra services mainly by telephone, but well-being services. So we're ringing up people, checking if they're okay on a regular basis to just make sure that everybody's okay. And we're liaising closely with family and friends and relatives, and indeed with all the other social services that impact on the lives of our people. So we've had to adapt very quickly, and it's been quite a challenge. And of course, not only the tenants but also the staff have had to, change their mode of working. We've had a number of people working from home that can, so we've had to adapt to that as well. And again, the technology helps there. Prior to this, I had my weekly team meeting via Zoom. So, we are, and I think that, what it is showing us is that we can adapt and we can have a different mode of operation to what we're used to.
Thank you for that. That's very interesting indeed. I've had the pleasure of being invited to a few of the social functions at various courts, and I have to admit, I've always been really struck by how social those events really are. And I imagine that the sort of social events is a big part of what people enjoy about living there. I just wonder if we don't know how long this is going to go on for, and we talked about shielding, which does seem to be a very open-ended thing at the moment. What are your thoughts on how you might address that longer term, if this has to go on for much, much longer?
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking about this all the time as to how are we going to, as the country starts to ease out of lockdown, how are we going to react to that, bearing in mind our potentially vulnerable population. So I think we will be certainly taking cautious steps to do that, and probably, being behind the government advice rather than trying to get ahead of it, for that very good reason. But I think we are going to have to think very carefully about how we operate in the future. I mean, in terms of running the buildings and so on, that I think we've got a handle on that now. The interesting thing will be things like, when a flat becomes available for whatever reason, we do look at, do we need to replace the kitchen? Do we need to replace the bathroom? And we get contractors in to do that. Well, at the moment, we're not using any outside contractors for obvious reasons. So that's going to have an impact on our ability to maintain our stock to the appropriate quality and standard. So we're going to have to think carefully about that. And I know other associations, because we talk to other housing associations as well, and they're all struggling with that. How do we maintain compliance on things like fire safety equipment and gas boilers and all that sort of thing? So we are, and we've had a number of discussions with regulators about how we are going to be regulated in the future when, one of our, just for argument's sake, one of our annual fire safety checks is to make sure that the fire alarm, the fire sensors in each flat are checked on an annual basis. Well, quite rightly, some tenants are saying, well, I don't want you to come into my flat to do that. So that's providing a challenge. How do we get around that? And to be honest, at the moment, I don't have all the answers. But we are having to think about changing our operating model significantly in order to maintain that, compliance, but also maintain our stock. And I think, we are going to have to do things differently, even if we do start to open up and have social events. Certainly in the near future, social distancing, for instance, I think is going to be around for a while. So it doesn't mean people can't speak to each other, but they're going to have to, recognize the social distancing constraints. But clearly the sort of big social events that we had in the past, at the moment, I can't see those happening this year. I think we're going to have to look very carefully at how we look at that next year. I think it's going to be a challenge until we get into a situation where the external environment is such that the risk is minimized. Then that's always going to be an issue for us. And of course, as soon as we start letting more people come in and out of the courts, more family, more friends, more contractors, more, then obviously the interactions between people go up, the risk level goes up, and it's managing that as you start to ease the lockdown, which is going to be a challenge for all of us, I think.
I must admit, I've done a few of these interviews now, and I'm always very struck about how things that we've taken for granted are incredibly complicated when it comes to talking about social isolation, shielding, and COVID-19 more broadly, and how people are adapting is interesting, because it's just things that we all take for granted.
Yeah, I mean, we've all had to adapt, and we've all had to do things differently. I mean, I have to say that the staff at Agamemnon have been brilliant the last 3 or 4 months, because they have just stepped up to the plate and, just adapted the way they do business overnight almost, and have done a brilliant job. And, they've always at the heart of whatever they've done has been the sort of safety and the tenants to make sure that we keep them all safe. And so far, we've managed to keep the virus out of the courts, so it's been successful. But I do worry that as we relax things, that will become harder and harder. But in terms of adaptations and what the future's going to look like, I think there will definitely be a different mindset. Certainly for a while, we are beginning to. I think it goes back to my thoughts about perspective earlier. It's what really is important to people. What is it important? What's important that we do right and well? And do we change our business operating model? Do we change the way that we react with tenants? Do we want to become more technically focused? I don't know. But for the tenants as well as for the staff, do we want to encourage them to get online and start becoming web surfers and so on to try and take advantage of all that technology? So there are a lot of things that we're going to have to adapt, and I think a lot of organisations, not necessarily us, because we're pretty lean manned anyway, to be honest. But I think a lot of organisations are really starting to have serious conversations about, well, how many people do I need to run my business? And I know. So it's not an issue for us, but I do know other organisations that are starting to have those sort of conversations about, well, what is it going to look like the other side? And that's going to be again a difficult process to go through. So, and also, what do we value now? So, I think the British public have always had a love affair with the NHS for many years, but clearly that's been highlighted during this crisis. And who'd have thought, that we would be clapping for HGV lorry drivers on a Thursday night? Normally we shout at them when they cut us up on the motorway. Now all of a sudden they're vitally important. And I think if it teaches us anything, what it does teach us is that actually the people that we thought were really important to running the country may not have been quite so important, and actually the really important ones are the ones that previously we've probably valued the least. And I think we need to change our perspective on that as well. The key workers, as they're now called, who actually keep the country running. Supermarket shelf stackers are the people that keep us going in these difficult times. And so I think we as a civilization, not civilization is wrong, as a group of people, as a society, we need to really think about who are the important people that keep us going in these difficult times, and I think some of the answers will be quite interesting.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's about what we value and how that has changed, and whether, of course, that we this new perspective that we have, whether we keep that perspective when things enter some sort of normal, whatever we mean by that. And whilst I'm talking about that, I would like you to do a bit of crystal ball gazing in terms of, aside from Agamemnon, what do you think the lasting impact of COVID-19 will be?
I think I think I know where I would like it to be. Whether it turns out this way or not is another matter. But there was a very interesting article in the BBC yesterday about a village called Piddlehinton in Dorset, who has suddenly rediscovered its community spirit. And actually, they are all looking out for each other. And I can say my own personal experience, where I live on the street here, there's a number of neighbours that we have got to know better as a result of this, because we have been looking out for them and helping each other out. And so I think that sense of community and that sense of looking after those that are less fortunate than ourselves, I would like to hope that is reinforced and continues beyond this particular crisis. And I think also what do we value? I think is certainly I think that's made me rethink what's really important and what do we value, and what particular services do we really value, and jobs and so on. So I think the lasting impacts, I mean, hopefully we'll be better prepared next time, which I think no matter what the I think and this is not a political point, but I think there is no doubt that as a country we were not well prepared for this event. And I don't want to go into whys and wherefores, but I think it's pretty obvious that we were not as well prepared for this as some other countries, and we need to think very carefully about that. But interestingly, what it has shown is that once we get going, we can actually move very quickly. And you look at things like the Nightingale hospitals, which were a fantastic effort to tackle the crisis. And when you look at it, the NHS has coped. I mean, it's been really difficult, and I'm not undermining the effort that they put in, but the NHS has coped because of the measures that they've taken and so on, and so we should be very grateful for that. But yeah, I think we will have to look back on this and think, well, and it may not be another pandemic, it may be another crisis of some sort, but how are we, in terms of our overall business continuity planning and crisis management planning, do we need to have a complete rethink on how we do that? And the answer to that is probably yes, I would have thought.
I don't think I'm going to disagree with you. Planning has been quite a big word, because obviously planning in the military context, training, all the things that we've talked about earlier, is really important. And I think it's quite a common theme that's coming up with some of these interviews. But on a lighter note, final question, what are you looking forward to doing most once this is all over?
Without a doubt, the one thing I'm looking forward to most is actually my daughter's wedding, which sadly should have taken place 2 weeks ago, but had to be cancelled. We've got a tentative date in the future, but that has been a difficult and challenging time for the family. I know we're not on our own in that, but clearly once this is over and once we can see a way ahead, that's going to be a significant goal for us as a family to have my daughter's wedding. But just to be honest, just seeing friends and family again. I mean, prior to COVID, if you looked at my diary, you would struggle to find a free weekend in my diary most of the time, because there was always something going on. I mean, I've got 3 grown-up children. They all live elsewhere. We've got friends that live elsewhere. We used to spend quite a lot of time on the road and visiting people and having them visit us and so on. So, just that social interaction, that ability to connect with people again, I think will be the biggest plus to our lives once this is all over. And hopefully the ability to get out on the water again, do some sailing, because we're keen sailors. But that's been denied us as well recently. So.
Well, I think a wedding is definitely something to look forward to, isn't it? But I can't help with when that will be, I'm afraid. I'd just like to say thank you very much, Nigel. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I really appreciate your time.
No problem. Thank you.
So, Mike, what did you think of that?
Well, I don't know how you do it, Steve. You really are a master at finding really interesting subjects to interview, and you're a master of technique of getting a lot out of them. I thought it was another masterly show.
Thank you very much. It's quite an unusual position to be in because, as you know, lots of these people are acquaintances or we know reasonably well, not as well as you do sometimes. And they don't often get the opportunity to just ask questions that they have to answer.
Yeah, and this one was, as you said before, a game of two halves. And, he talked about his naval service, which was the first 35 years of his adult life since he joined the Navy at 18. And then he talks more recently about his experience as CEO of the Agamemnon Housing Association, which I found equally fascinating. But it was a tour de force.
Thank you very much, Mike. So let's start with the first half then.
Yeah, so I alluded to at the start that I had known Nigel for some 38 years, and actually that coincides with the Falklands War. So I was serving in a submarine at the time, which was coming out of refit in Devonport Naval Base, Devonport Dockyard, and he had just returned from the Falklands via the Queen Elizabeth, as he said in his interview, having stepped off a sinking, having abandoned ship. And what was I didn't know at the time just how much he was going through. He hid it well, but what really struck me during the interview was this sense of guilt of having survived. I thought that was incredible, and the fact is they have this annual reunion, which they get together in order to remember the 22 colleagues they lost, and this sense of guilt that why did I survive? He asked. Why me? And I thought that was very poignant.
It was, and it's a common refrain. Actually, we have spoken to many other veterans who've been in not dissimilar circumstances, and we do hear that quite often. But I was, as a civilian, really struck by this idea that for one moment he was in the South Atlantic, about to abandon ship, and the next moment he's back in Blighty. Like it didn't happen almost. I thought that was, I don't know how you even begin to cope with a situation like that.
I mean, to be honest, I don't know how you cope with that. I've never really coped with something as traumatic as that. But my observations, albeit, a long time ago, was that he seemed to be handling it very well. But of course, these things run deep and they can surface sometime later. I love the fact that they hold this memorial service every year to recognise and remember the 22 that had fallen. I think that's lovely, and as we spoke before, this sense of guilt that obviously he spoke about it now. He still thinks about it 38 years later.
Something like that just doesn't leave you, does it? But I also liked that no matter how sort of challenging the COVID-19 world is, they were still keeping those reunions and maintaining, or the reunions, that they'd had, and maintaining those links with old comrades.
Exactly. And I think, one of the lessons of lockdown is how you adapt to the circumstances, and technology has a role to play here. And here we are doing podcasts, from our own homes, when normally we'll be doing this in the studio you have set up in the Hot Walls.
Yes, that's true. But I think it's also about having the idea and finding the people that are prepared to give it a go. I'm looking at you, quite literally.
You're very kind. I also was interested, you drew out of him what experiences he drew upon his naval time in terms of preparing for lockdown. And he talked about, isolation, and even in a ship. And he described being in a, tin with 250 people, that you still can feel isolated or, be on your own at times in those circumstances. And he also talked about routine and discipline, and how much actually having a routine was for him particularly important, and I think for many other people as well, during this time of lockdown. So even though lockdown is slightly lifting in terms of restrictions, it is still important to have a routine. And that's come across in a number of your episodes, I think.
Yes, it has. I think he said, "You are never alone, but you can still feel lonely," which I thought was quite a telling phrase.
Lovely phrase, wasn't it? He also spoke about sense of purpose, and I know this is a big thing with you, and with this whole thing is, in this current strange circumstances we live in, questioning each and every one of our sense of purposes. I think it's really important to have a sense of purpose, what am I here for? Is I think the expression he used. I think that, and if people haven't got that, that we need to find ways of helping them achieve it. Sense of purpose is a really important thing, I think.
Yes, and people derive it in different ways, don't they? Whether that's through work or perhaps religion or volunteering. So it's not just a straightforward thing to define. But yes, I think it's critical to how people feel and how they navigate the life in general.
Navigate's a very good word, particularly in a naval context. But also, I think sense of purpose is like having a compass in your brain. It gives you a direction to travel. And if you've got a sense of purpose, you've got you somewhere to head to. You have a future state, a vision that you want to head towards. And the sense of purpose is what drives you along that road. So I think navigate's a very good word.
Kind of takes us on to the second half of the interview, doesn't it? Because I think he joined Agamemnon not that long ago. You may know more than I, perhaps.
Well, I don't know when he joined, but I know that he's been CEO for about a year and a half, I think. And he stepped in as an interim role, but I think he kind of liked it and decided to stay. And actually, that's where I met up with him, in relation to Agamemnon. And I might say, for your listeners at this point, I've been practicing saying Agamemnon for hours before this episode, because it's one of those words I can never get right. And we've actually got a submarine called HMS Agamemnon that's currently in build-up in Barrow-Furness. And I've never been able to say it right, so I'm really pleased that I've been able to say it 3 times in a row at the moment without stuttering.
Congratulations, Mike. I'm impressed.
I think what the Agamemnon Housing Association do is really fantastic. And it isn't just about providing housing for residents. There's a whole range of other services they provided. And there was quite a lot that you spoke about in terms of the social activities, the events, which of course have been curtailed as a result of the current pandemic. But actually, they're thinking about how they can adapt and use technology and use social distancing to try and get them involved. Because actually, it is these social activities that help give people a sense of purpose. Particularly if they're elderly or vulnerable or shielding for some reason, the more we can do to engender social activity somehow, whether it be virtual or socially distanced face to face, the better, in my opinion.
Yes, extended periods of social isolation just aren't good for you, no matter who you are and what your circumstances. I think that presents a real challenge, especially when you're living in a court, as they call them, where that whole social activity it's almost part of the daily routine.
It is. I got the feeling, though, that the Agamemnon, there I said it again correctly, Housing Association is in good hands. And I know the chairman well as well. So I think they're thinking about their residents. They're thinking about how to look after those that have specific issues and problems. They're not a care home, as he said, but they're much more than just providing a roof over their heads. I think it's a fantastic organisation, and we need many more associations like Agamemnon, for other communities, I suspect.
Yes, and not breached by COVID-19 as well, so that's not an insignificant achievement.
It's fantastic, actually. Just that goes probably down to routine and discipline, as he said. There was a couple of questions that you asked at the end, which were very revealing as well. You asked about what he was looking forward to, and actually what he was, hoping would be a legacy from this. And of the latter, he spoke about this, breaking out of community spirit. And he mentioned a place in Dorset called Piddle Hinton. But actually, in the street I live, I've noticed that there's been a breakout of conspiracy. A WhatsApp group has been set up. I've now discovered the names of all the neighbours, whereas I only knew about half of them. And we actually got to know each other and worked out at what we can do to help. And so actually, I think he's right. I think the sense of community spirit that has broken out as a result of this, wouldn't that be great if that continued when we no longer needed to worry about COVID-19?
It absolutely would, and that's the challenge, isn't it? I think people have responded generally in a very positive way. It's maintaining that once things get closer to normal, again, whatever we mean by that.
Well, who knows what the new normal looks like, but anyway. The other thing he said was he was looking forward to, obviously, his daughter's wedding, which was meant to be 2 weeks ago, and has been put on hold. They've got a tentative date, but they don't know whether they'll be able to do it. And also returning maybe full or part to his very busy social diary, where there was rarely a weekend that he wasn't spending visiting people. And actually maybe we may reflect on what's important during this, and actually travel less, because one of the silver linings from all of this, of course, is a vast reduction in air pollution as a result of people travelling less. And if we could only capture that and not go back to where we were before, we'd be in a much better position.
Yes, you're right on both counts, whether it's to do with air pollution and travel or community spirit. There's definitely some opportunities opening up there. As we said, how do we maintain it? We don't have the answer for that yet.
No, but at least there are great minds thinking about it. And I know that there are people saying, well, actually, this has given us opportunity to move ahead when we didn't think we could do. But actually, do we need to do all that air travel? Do we need to use the car? Why not use the bike and walk more? What more can we do? So I think there's lots to think about.
So when you say great minds thinking about it, I trust you're not including either of us in that equation.
Well, I'm certainly not including mine. I mean, I wouldn't dare to suggest that you're not a great mind. In fact, I bend over in astonishment at your tech ability to make this podcast work with me at one end of it. So I think you are the tech guru from my eyes.
Well, the challenge isn't the technology, Mike. It's getting you to do what you're told.
Well, there you have a much bigger challenge. I think.
Yes, you're right. And I think on that note, we should finish. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more, why not subscribe to the Lockdown podcast? To get in touch with Company of Makers, email us at lockdown@companyofmakers.com.